The recording is on, Gail, and I'm
Great.
pleased to introduce you here on Saturday, the 9th of May, a beautiful, what is going to be a toasty May day here.
Oh,
And we're
yeah.
excited to have you actually share virtually what would have been our May 14th presentation, the May 14th program for the Master Gardeners of Grace Harbor and Pacific County. We're very thrilled to have you virtually. And of course, we'd certainly hope to see you in person, because I know what you have to share with us today is only going to do justice when we see the orchids that you're going to be sharing with us.
Well, thank you. And it's delightful to be here the day before Mother's Day. So a belated happy Mother's Day to those of you who see this after Sunday. And I'm ready to go. And if you see my bangs look a little funny, it's, do-at-home bangs. So
We're all doing a lot of doing at home for sure.
yes, indeed. So Kelly, were you going to ask me some questions?
No, just go ahead. Just jump into the program, and
Okay,
I'll engage with you. I'll engage with you as I have questions as we go along.
Okay, so many people have difficulty getting their orchids to bloom, and getting orchids to bloom is much easier than you think. So what you need to know to grow orchids and rebloom them, is where they grow, how many different orchids there are, the number of genus, the recipe for growing, and sources for information. And I have to apologize, the sunblock just rolled right into my eyes, so they're chewing through. So forgive me. We've had lots of technical difficulties, and this is just one more. So if you see the map, and you can see the Arctic Circle at the top and the Antarctic, orchids grow on all the space in between those two solid lines. We have cypripediums that grow everywhere, and they're the ground orchids and natives, and many here in Washington State. So how many are there? Andy Phillips from Andy's Orchids, who just specializes in species orchids, says there's over 70,000 species of orchids. There are over 200,000 hybridized orchids and 3,668 genera. So it is the next to the largest group of plants after milkweed. And here is a selection of different orchids. Oh my God, my eyes are tearing. I'm so sorry, folks. And the one in the top center is Angola virginalis, because they felt it looked like a nun in the cloister habit. To the bottom left of that one is Covecchii, and that is the wing, the leaf span can be over 8 inches. And the one on the far left of that one is a Cypripedium pubescens, which was one of mine, which I grew in a pot and took to a show the next year, and it was awarded.
These are spectacular photos too, by the way, Gail.
Thank you. Thank you. So the one to the right of Covecchii is Pleurophthalus. The one to the right of that one is a Phragmipedium. The one in the bottom right-hand corner is an Angraecum, and you see the long, like spur coming out. That's the one Darwin anticipated that would have a moth or a butterfly with a long pubiscus that would reach all the way in to fertilize that. And they caught that picture of that about 10 years ago, a night picture.
But you're saying Darwin had actually theorized that there was some bird or insect that actually had some sort of specialized...
Not a bird, a moth or butterfly. Until they had a night flying a camera that worked at night, they could not capture that. So on to the left of that one is a Vandaceous orchid, which we'll see more closely. And to the left of that one is oh my gosh, it's escaped my name, Catasetum, and that's the female form. The male flower of that species, of that genera, Looks very different. It sort of has like a little fish hook. And when a bee lands on it, it sprays it. And then the bee flies off to find the female, and it crawls in and it leaves the pollen. Doesn't know it's looking for the female. It just knows it's looking for another source to get honey or nectar. And on the far left of the screen, the purple and flower is a masdevallia. It sort of looks like an alien. So I'm going to discuss orchids now that are commonly grown in homes. I'm not going to focus on those that would be difficult to grow in homes. And I have to tell you, if you can see to the, I'm going to tilt my screen a little, the orchids over there.
We do.
That are lavender pink and dark red and another red. They are Meltoniopsis, and they smell like roses right now. And it's overwhelming, just wonderful.
And those are orchids that you have indeed been cultivating and nurturing totally in your home, not in a greenhouse or other,
Well, no, I have a greenhouse in my garage.
Okay.
But I have grown these on windowsills in Pennsylvania with only north-facing windows. And I will get to ways you can do that as we go on. I'll tell you all kinds of ways to make orchid growing in a home very easily. Okay, now this was at an orchid vendor in Pennsylvania, Waldor Orchids. And they started as growing cut cattleyas for corsages. And these are just a variety of the colors and the shapes. And they grew from doing cattleyas just for corsages into the orchid plant business when it became a little more reasonable for people to afford. And these are cymbidiums. And a lot of people see these in flower arrangements or corsages. And a little tip to get these to bloom again, they can be outside till it's almost freezing in order to encourage it to rebloom again. Dendrobians, and if you look at the stalk or the inflorescent, it's growing and it almost looks like bamboo.
Mm-hmm.
But it's not. And this is a paleopedilum. They're often called lady slippers. And you see all the veining, and you see all the striping in the top sepal. That's actually helps as a landing strip for the insect to see. And if you look at the little bumps on the other sepals that are coming out to the side, and you see little red dots on the vertex.
Yes, it's fascinating.
They're like little warts with hair on them. They have little, like they could almost use a shave, or like somebody wants to tweeze the hairs out of a wart.
Now, this is a great example. So is this a cultivar that has been highly specialized?
This, I think, is actually a hybridized one.
Okay.
Be wrong. It's maybe a primary hybridized. It's not a species.
But I'm curious that even though it's hybridized, it still has proper insect function. You're saying insects still.
Oh yeah, they are. In fact, when I put my orchids outside in the summer, I have a shade house that it's a portable garage, one of those portable garages, and I put shade cloth over it. I often see bees inside trying to pollinate them.
Very interesting.
It's very interesting.
This is absolutely fascinating, by the way. The beauty of this particular photograph is stunning in terms of.
There are more to come.
Yeah.
These are the Meltoniopsis that I was showing you, and these are genera, and they have Meltonias and Meltoniopsis. Some people call these the pansy orchids. I do not. They are not pansy orchids. To me, they look nothing like a pansy. Do you see the veining in the bottom? With hybridization, they actually get to be more pronounced. For example, wrong one. Let me pull the one that I want you to see. Oops.
While you're pulling that up,
Here it is. Can you see it?
Oh yeah.
The waterfall.
Yeah.
Oh, I gave a talk to the judges when I was entering the judging program, which I did not finish. I'm a judging program dropout. I had done a lot of research, and we found that through hybridizing, they call those waterfalls, the veining, they become more pronounced. So they were always there, and they originally thought that the veining only came out through hybridization. They didn't realize it was already existing. But as you can see in this picture, the veining does go down all the way. So hybridization only makes it more pronounced.
And so you're hinting then that a quality of highly judged orchids is articulation of veins and and just key
shape, size. They want it to be totally round and no recurving of the petals. And that means in this one, you'll see the petals curve back a little bit. But this is the way they grow in nature. And, sometimes I have issues with trying to put our values on what a plant should look like.
Understood.
To what it really is in nature. And not all of the Miltoniopsis have a fragrance, but many do. So, and this was hybridized by a gentleman who's no longer hybridizing in Hawaii. And then there's a Phalaenopsis, and you see the stripes in here. And that is from hybridizing. They mix a purple with white and a little bit more and this and that, and they move it around. But do you see on the lip, the brown part, the part that stands out more? That's the landing strip for the insect going into where the ovaries and the pistil are. And if you see a blue orchid, do not buy it because they are not blue in nature. They will become white the next blooming cycle. They dye them the way they used to dye carnations for St. Patrick's Day, dye them green. So you don't want that.
But this is purple, though. So the one you were just saying, you were just showing, correct?
This is a hybridized form.
Hybridized, okay.
And these were done by orchid growers. These were not dyed. There wasn't purple water. They weren't stuck in purple water, so it would shoot up and turn the colors.
Okay.
This is the way it's growing from nature, from after being hybridized. Then nature takes over. And recipe for growing and blooming orchids. Well, there is no exact recipe because everybody's home is a tad different. Everybody's greenhouse is different. There is no hard and fast rules. So it's a little bit of a trial and error. So the most important ingredient is knowledge of the environment where the genus grows. Because right plant, right place, as master gardeners, we all know that's very important. Same thing goes for orchids. And the more I hear talks as a master gardener myself, I have learned that plants are plants, and orchids have much in common with every other plant in terms of they need the right environment to grow. And how you can learn what the growing requirements are is to go to the library and read books or go online. And the best site for going online is AOS, which stands for American Orchid Society.org. If you go there, you can go download a lot of fabulous information that's been accumulated over the years, and you don't have to be a member.
Now, the key point you're getting at here, of course, is that, when you talk about understanding the environment where the genus grows, I would think that would mean that you're trying to recreate a very unique, dare I say, I appreciate it doesn't necessarily have to be a tropical environment, because as you indicated, you have orchids growing, across the globe.
Well, my orchids are not mostly tropical. See, that's a piece of myth about orchids. I have orchids that grow down outside in the snow from Japan.
So the idea that just depending upon that genus, right, understanding that if that genus is going to flourish.
For example, when you want to plant a plant here, suppose you have fallen in love with a native plant that grows in Eastern Washington, and you want to grow it here in Western Washington. You have to figure out how can you possibly replicate the same growing conditions. And if you can't, then perhaps you shouldn't try growing it here.
Sure.
So that's same thing with You don't want to put a hydrangea that can handle morning sun and hot afternoon sun. The same basis. You need to give the plant what it needs, which is why I'm going over some of the more common orchids that you can grow in the home and not be frustrated with failure.
Excellent.
Okay. So what you need to include in your recipe for growing and blooming orchids is you need to have light, water, fertilizer, temperature, humidity. You need pots, growing medium, and good air movement. And I'm going to go over each of what each of these things means. So light, natural light, exposure of windows in the home. You need to know where you're north, south, east, west. And I'm sure most of you know that because you're master gardeners. You don't want to put any orchids in a southern window that's going to get full blast right up on a windowsill during the hot summer, or even in the west, unless you have an overhang and can provide some sheer curtains or move them back a little bit. Artificial lights, there are grow lights, T5s, T8, and LEDs. When I started growing orchids in 1997, my windows were all northern exposure, so we hung grow lights, fluorescent tube grow lights from chains in the windows. And I had humidity trays on windowsills that were 4 inches wide, which was a trick, let me tell you. And I grew orchids. I could never grow phalaenopsis, the easiest ones, for some reason. But the harder ones, the ones that other people couldn't even bloom in their greenhouses often, I could grow. So the T5s are the ones that I'm still using at this point in time. I have 6 banks of lights in a 7 by 9 foot greenhouse with 2 major fans and a small fan. And you'll see pictures of the greenhouse at the very end. They are a little cooler growers than the T8s, and they do have full spectrums. The LED fluorescents aren't quite there yet. So I'm waiting for them to be developed a little bit more before I invest my money in using those.
Are there limitations about how much light during the day you provide?
Yes, well, you want to find out how much light there's in the environment that they grow in. In the winter, I give them 8 hours to 10 hours of light, and well, it's actually their summer, and so a lot of them are dormant. So as we roll into spring, they're getting 12 to 14 hours of light a day in the greenhouse, and then when they move outside, they're getting whatever we get here.
Mm-hmm.
So water, how much do you water? How often do you water? Ice cubes and water quality. So I get my water tested, and the source that I use that I think is the best source for water is J.R. Peters. The other thing you can do is collect rainwater and use rainwater. If you know your water is really good for orchids, you don't have to have it tested. I got mine tested here and I sent it off to Peters. It's $40. Then it was $40 a few years ago. And they said the water was so good here, I didn't have to have any additives. So that informed me when I went to get my fertilizer, what kind of fertilizer to get. And I will get to that in a few slides.
So when J.R. Peters reports back to you after you send them a water test, for example, what are they actually doing this relative to orchids in particular, or just to the quality of what are they testing for?
Water, I was testing for orchids.
Okay.
So they could tell me if I needed any special additives to the form. They recommended fertilizer to use for orchids. And that's what I was interested in.
So right from the get-go, though, you're suggesting that normal tap water coming out of city water or normal well water coming out of our normal wells may not be appropriate because of some chemical inclusions?
Yeah, or nutrients, or missing some.
Mm-hmm.
So and I found that my city water here, I live in Fircrest, which we share I think we get water from Tacoma, but I'm not 100%. I get some people saying yes and some people say no, but my water bill goes to Fircrest. they said it was fine, and I just do rainwater, a form of fertilizer. But I'll get into that later. So the fertilizer comes in powder, liquid, time released, when to fertilize, and how much to fertilize. And I do not use compost on my orchids. They do not get compost in their environment. Let me go back to what these different fertilizers are. So you can buy a powdered fertilizer. Jack's is also Peter's. So they often recommend their fertilizers or another kind. There's a liquid fertilizer, time released, an Osmocote or Nutricote, and you can add those to your orchids and not have to worry about fertilizing for 180 days. So when you water, the fertilizer will, be released as it is in your normal garden. When to fertilize and how much to fertilize. So you want to fertilize when the orchids start to grow again, when you see new roots coming out or some new leaves starting. Some people fertilize a weak amount of fertilizer. So if it says a half a teaspoon, they'll do an eighth of a teaspoon every week or less. So I tend to fertilize, for me, all year round. I'm wasting a lot of fertilizer, but some of my orchids are growing at this point, and some of them are not growing. They just bloom and grow at different times. I have over 200. Back east, I had over 1,000, and I had things blooming all year round. So for me, it was just easier to waste a little bit of money in fertilizer and do it all the time.
In all cases, however, you're recommending a specialized fertilizer mix for orchids, you're saying. This is as opposed to trying to concoct your own blend based upon nutrient.
Yeah, but you can use Osmocote. You can use that. You want to do a 20-20-20, a balanced fertilizer, but a weak amount. You don't want to do the full amount. The full amount will burn the roots and kill your orchid.
And any special micronutrients beyond the 20-20-20 blend?
No.
Okay.
I don't use that. I use MSU fertilizer, which has been, I don't like to push particular products we're not supposed to as master gardeners. This is one that I use. Other people in the group are using the Blue Powder Orchid. I don't like to use Bloom Boost. They're not balanced, and I did not see anything successful, any change in the orchids. So, and I did more and more research. I found that a 20-20-20 use consistently worked best for me. But
consistently again, and sparingly, as you pointed out.
Everyone's conditions are different, and I use half or a quarter of what you're supposed to use, so I don't burn the tips.
So that was a key point you're making here, is that it's consistent and sparingly.
Yes. So what I did at home when I was growing in windowsills is I would take the orchids to the sink and run water through the medium. I didn't get the leaves wet. Make sure I got the roots wet. Make sure I got it all the way through. And after they finished drip drying, I had a mixture in a gallon bottle or 2-liter soda bottles I collected from neighbors, and pre-mixed the fertilizer and just let it sit. And then I would run fertilizer through. And I would do that every other Sunday. My watering day was Sunday. It was just easier for me because I work full time. So Sundays were the day. And I enjoyed my time with my orchids then. So another thing you need to think about is humidity. And you need to have humidity in the environment. And with a lot of hot air heat systems that we have here on the West Coast, you lose a lot of humidity. So how can you add humidity? Well, for my house plants, I am using a humidifier now, a room humidifier. And they are doing fine. Until I started using the humidifier, I had lots of challenges. And I like to have houseplants because for me, it's winter gardening. Another thing you can do is if you can see me, you see these two plant saucers?
Yes.
One is smaller than the other. I invert it upside down. And you can put water in around the edges. And the plant would sit up here, but not in water. So the air, the water evaporates, it adds humidity. And a third thing you can do is mist the medium of your plants. You don't want it when the crown of the Phalaenopsis, which is what a lot of people have, the leaves come out like this, the big fat leaves. You don't want to get water in the crown in there in the center. You get crown rot. So you have to be very careful. You want to just cover the medium. You don't want to have the leaves getting wet, especially at night.
So the humidifier is probably that simplest solution. Do you have that close? You actually probably have that in the greenhouse during the wintertime or in the house?
I don't need it in my greenhouse in the winter. I maintain between 50 and 80% humidity, which is the 80 is a little too much for some of the plants, because it just doesn't dry out a lot in there.
But in the house, then you have your
My
humidifier.
greenhouse is inside of my garage. So it's I try to get as much excess water off the floor because the water will puddle. So I try to use a squeegee and pull it out, but it just stays humid in there. It doesn't dry. And I use a little one of those oil room size heaters, and it heats it up if it gets too cold. I also have insulation in the garage ceiling, so it cuts down on the amount of added heat I have to add.
Are you always moving your orchids from your garage greenhouse into the house and back and forth?
No. No, I have a kitten, so I'm not moving the orchids inside. Not with a kitten. So, but when I grew my orchids on my windowsills, I did have humidifiers going and a small fan, but I'll get to air movement next. So the next thing you need to know is temperature. That's very important to know what temperature range means. Some orchids grow warm, and warm means 65 minimum to 95 maximum. Intermediate is 55 to 65 minimum, and that's at night. These are the minimums or night temperatures in winter, and 85 summertime maximum. Cool growers can grow 40 to 55 degrees in a winter night and below 80 in a summer day. Most of what I personally grow are intermediate to cool. I sold, before I moved here, I had to get rid of all my Stanhope, which were warmer growing. I didn't bring any of my warmer growing plants here because I didn't have a greenhouse and I knew I wasn't going to build one outside. So you need to know what the temperature range is. And you need to have a period of cooler nights in order for most orchid to spike. And what's a spike? An inflorescent, that's what the flower bud will grow on. So Phalaenopsis can sit in your windows at night because your windows your house is usually, I would think, at least 55 degrees at night, and that will help it to continue to grow. Warm might be 65, though I found that most of my friends who grow Phalaenopsis, their temperature is lower than 65 degrees at night in their homes. And so by the window, it's cooler, and that's good. That'll help it to spike. So it's very easy. You don't have to, you can just leave them in the window. They'll get light. And if you have only north facing windows without light, you can always add a grow light. For example, you know, the odd craft lights they sell in Joann's or Michael's or whatever.
Okay.
They are fluorescents, and some of them have 18-inch tubes or longer. You can use those as grow lights. You can have them on the orchids during the day and turn it around so you can read at night using that light. That's a little tip.
There you go.
Pots. There are various kinds of pots. There are clay pots, and this is an unglazed clay pot. And they have them, it's the terracotta ones. Usually this is called a cool pot. This is a specialized one. We have plastic. Whoops, I almost lost an orchid there.
Careful.
And this one has holes in it so it can get, water can drain out and it can dry out. And the clear plastic, which is my new favoriteest kinds of pot to use, the clear one, because then I can see the water getting in all around the roots. I can see that it's really hydrated well.
And your point is about the if it's clear, you're not really concerned about heat retention because you're managing heat, in a via a separate.
It's not for heat. It's not for heat, but the plant will stay moist for longer. Clay pots dry out much more quickly.
Certainly.
So the plastic keeps them hydrated longer. So if you don't want to be a slave to these plants. Nobody wants to be a slave to growing anything. And
although we all have a little bit more time at home
right now, but when it's over, we won't. And then here is another kind of pot. Can you see the bottom?
Yeah, very big holes.
Little screen in the bottom. I buy fiberglass screening fabric and make little cuts and put this into the medium. Will stay in the pot and not fall out all over the place. We also have baskets for plants that need more light, need water to come out more quickly. And there's other kinds of mediums for those. And they have these orchid pots. Somebody asked me about this yesterday with the holes in them, the pretty ones. And if you put medium in here, a lot of the medium will drain out. So I use them more for decoration. If I bring an orchid in, oh, it smells so good for a centerpiece. I'm sorry. You smell it?
If only we could.
I use it more for that purpose. And when you get an orchid, unlike other plants that we grow, you don't want it to put it in a huge pot so it'll fill out. They're slow growers. So I only pot my orchids a 1/2 inch bigger. So if it's in a 3-inch pot, I'll put it in a 3.5-inch pot. You don't want to go to a 4-inch pot. And you determine the size of the pot by the roots. So you may have this huge plant at the top, but the roots are kind of small. That's the size pot you're going to put it in. And they don't like to have a lot of room. They like to be a little pot bound. Now, remember that most of these plants in nature do not grow on the ground. They grow on moss growing on tree roots, on tree bark or branches. So they're not parasitic. They grow in other mediums. So like in a phalaenopsis, you may see all the roots coming out. They call them air roots. They're growing there to get nutrients out of the environment. The floor of the jungle, the rainforest, are not necessarily nutrient rich. So they grow at the top of the tree canopy. And they're pretty amazing. And in nature, actually, phalaenopsis grow down. They didn't grow up on the tree branch with the flowers sticking up. They grew down. But people didn't want to have to mount them on trees in their homes. So they hybridized them and they grew them until they would grow upright, the way we see them today. If you go to garden centers that have orchids in Florida, you have the luck to do that. You will see them growing down, the phalaenopsis.
So the key summary of what you've just shared here with respect to the pots and the watering, and then of course translating that back to how they grow in nature, is that they don't like to have they're not unlike many plants. They don't like a lot of a big wet medium that their roots would rest in, daily.
They don't like to have wet feet.
Yeah.
So
And yeah,
Phalaenopsis, especially, you don't want them sitting in water. When you buy them in the stores, they come in these pretty ceramic pots without any holes in the bottom. And people just water them and water them and water them, and then they drown and they rot and they die.
so it's very impressive what
Do is
what you're,
the first
yeah.
thing to do is take them out of those decorative pots. They're not even, unless you're going to drill holes in them, don't even use them.
But it's clear the pots that you shared with us have huge holes relative to other conventional plants, right? So you want that water to drain very effectively.
Yeah. And you want airflow.
Hmm.
You want airflow to get in to them.
And it's fascinating. You're talking about the very small, incredibly small pots, I would think, relative to the size of the plant itself.
Yes, and I forgot to bring down my little teeny orchids, but if you'll, at the very end, if you can stop it and then start recording again, I can go get one for you.
Sure, we can do that.
Show you. Okay, so let's continue on then. So potting medium. You can use sphagnum moss, which is moss from trees. Sphagnum moss comes from New Zealand. That's the best kind to get. Or moss from trees here. You can take moss off your own trees carefully so you don't hurt the trees. You can use sunshine, which is a potting mix here, and add perlite to it. You can mount them on pieces of driftwood that you've soaked a lot, or on cork. I like to use wood, hardwoods particularly, because they don't disintegrate very quickly. You can use clay balls that come from Germany, and some of my phragmipediums that like to be in a lot of water, I grow that way in a pot that has holes 1 inch from the bottom, a half an inch apart. And what I do every single day is flush them so all the dirty water comes out, because water will accumulate below this line here, and
Hmm.
flush that out. I have a mix here for this is for Phalaenopsis. It's got sphagnum and bark and perlite in it. And the perlite gives space for the water to run in between so it doesn't get too clogged up. And you need to repot your plants every couple of years, because the bark and the sphagnum moss denigrates. And the roots, even though you can't see them, sometimes have little tiny hairs on the roots, and they will get clogged up and won't be able to take in the water or other nutrient, the fertilizers that you're doing. So there's all different kind of barks. There's pine bark. There's a bark from, there's a harder bark, which is coming from other places that doesn't denigrate as quickly. A lot of the fir bark that came from America is not dry enough and denigrates very quickly, unfortunately.
Now that sunshine potting mix, is that a sunshine potting mix specifically for orchids, or is there a particular type? Because sunshine makes
No,
it.
sunshine potting mix is what people use for houseplants. I know our propagation group for the master gardeners here uses them when they're making cuttings for the plant sale to propagate them.
Mhm. There's a number of different kinds of sunshines, though. For example, we use it.
Oh, I don't,
Yeah.
it's just a regular potting mix, and I always add perlite to mine.
Okay.
Brand that I've seen at the prop group. I don't use it myself.
Okay.
And some people use it for There was one grower back east that grew them, Phalaenopsis and that, and just would water them until she would see a drop come out of the bottom. Other people call that growing them in mud. So she could grow them that way. As I said earlier, there are many, many different ways to grow them, and what works for you may not work for the next person in the next home.
And going back to the bark, you're not recommending the typical hemlock or Doug fir or cedar bark that you would buy here for mulch.
No, not at all. It's too big. It's not dried. It's not aged. And it's Some of it's dyed with chemicals in it. I would not use that, or sprayed with stuff for insects. I would not use that. And even the potting mix, like the Miracle Grow, it's so full of debris that I bought it once to see what would happen. And I shook it and shook it and shook it every day for 5 days. And so all the debris would get to the bottom, the finer pieces, and there was very little good material left. And then I would soak that and drain it, and soak it and drain it to get rid of all the debris. There are sources for potting medium that you can order online that you might want to go to for that.
Okay.
But a lot of Andy uses the Oregon moss snail. He grows species orchids that are mounted, so that's what I've moved to. And Phalaenopsis grow well in that kind of medium as well. You may have to check to see if they're drying out more frequently or not. So I'm going to move on here. Air movement. Air movement is very important for orchids. With the dry air heat in the houses, you do get a lot of air movement. If you have another kind of heat, you may, or you feel there was not enough air movement in your home, you can always add a small oscillating fan.
So baseboard heating, in which there's no air movement, right?
You'd have
Would
to add
be
a fan.
at a fan.
Yeah, I had hot water in my house back east, hot air radiators and hot water radiators, baseboards. But I still had to add humidity, and I added fans for air movement.
And just a gentle breeze you're suggesting here. This is not hurricane force winds coming through
No,
there.
very light, very light.
Yeah.
You don't want to knock them over. And sometimes after you water them, you can put them back in a ceramic pot to anchor them down so if you can't get a low enough air movement.
And the air movement is a 24/7. It's continual.
Yeah, because there's always a breeze growing in the environment orchids growing.
Makes sense.
And causes for lack of reblooming, insufficient light, or lack of fertilization. Now, some people say, I never refertilize them. I never fertilize my orchids at all, and they rebloom. I never repot them. And, lucky them. My orchids have, just do really well the way I'm suggesting they grow. If you have insufficient light, you'll know you will, because the new leaves will be much darker, like a dark forest green, than the old ones, almost like a black green.
So that's an easy symptom to look for.
You need to add light.
Mm-hmm. So that's an easy symptom to look for. Mm-hmm.
Yes. Or let me just go back to this. Too much light. And I think there's a slide coming up that says this. If your orchids leaves are almost yellow, you're giving them too much light. Move them. And if they start getting black spots on them, that could be sunburn. Causes for lack of reblooming, also incorrect temperature, too warm, too cool. Insufficient temperature range between day and night. They like a 10 to 15 degree change in temperature. They want it to be lower at night, 10 degrees to 15 degrees lower at night than during the daytime.
So that's a significant, by the way, that's a significant gap that we might not have in our home environment.
Near your windows, you won't have to worry.
Okay.
A windowsill will take care of that. Another is if you don't give them a lack of rest period. Some orchids need a rest period. Cataseum don't want to be watered until they have a 6-inch green growth. Once you cut off the stalk, the flowering inflorescent, you cut that off. If you continue watering it, you'll just rot it. It will not grow. It will not bloom. So you must look to see when the plant is dormant, and you can do some research on that. The tips of the roots aren't pink. Right now I have Valcata Phoenicia, Niciata. They're Japanese species orchids, and they're in their Vandaceous family, and the roots, the tips are ruby red. They're so beautiful. So I know it's time to start watering and fertilizing those again.
Now you're able to see those tips of the roots because they're in those plastic pots, or they're coming, or the roots are
Well,
sending through.
yes, they start coming up on the plastic pots, but I had to actually remount. I had to mount mine because it was just too humid for them to sit in pots in my greenhouse in my growing condition. But I'll show you other things as we move forward to help remediate that. Okay.
Okay.
And causes of bud blast. Bud blast is when the buds fall off before they bloom. And that's too little light, too much watering, overwatering, a lack of humidity, putting ripe fruit near a budded plant. The gases the fruit gives out will cause the orchids to blast, or moving a plant right before all the flowers are open.
So keep your bananas away from your orchids.
Or your apples, or your pears, or your strawberries. Yeah, absolutely. Cultural problems. If you have discolored leaves, it can indicate many things. Reddish or yellow leaves, too much sun. New leaves darker than the old, too little sun. Pale color, not enough fertilizer. Or no.
So there's a lot of cues, right? There's a lot of visual cues you can pick up on. Yeah.
Yes, indeed. Cultural problems. When your leaves wilt or leaf drop. Check for insects or disease, dehydration, or the temperatures are too high. In the summer, when I put the orchids outside, I use a shade cloth that's called aluminette, which is not really aluminum, but it's looks like aluminum fabric. And it keeps it a little cooler in the growing area. I learned about this in Florida, and the summers in Philadelphia are god awful. 95%, 95 degree days and 100-degree humidity. It's humidity. It's awful. So I would go out and water the orchids several times a day because they just would dry out so quickly in that kind of heat. And Phalaenopsis, if they're dehydrated, the leaves sort of go, bleh, they drop, they get rubbery, they're icky. And I was doing some research on that, and this was online. I read about it and tried it. Somebody gave me some orchids for our master gardener plant sale that were completely dehydrated. She had gotten them from someone, stuck them in her basement, and left them there for about a month with no light and no water. So I washed off all the potting medium, cleaned it off, and put them in glasses with black tea. And I changed the tea, gave them fresh tea every few days. And lo and behold, they got rehydrated. The chemical, the acids in the tea must help carry the water there more quickly. So that is a tip that is not necessarily approved on any of the Master Gardener sites, but there's not too much about orchids on them anyhow. So I'm going to move on. Shrunken Pseudobulbs. And pseudobulbs are, I'm going to hold this plant up. This is an oncidium, and it's a primary cross, which means it's only been crossed once. I mean, these are pseudobulbs. These are not wilted. These are nice and healthy. This is in bloom. Oops. Can you see it?
I certainly can. That's amazing foliage, by the way. The foliage looks very tough and strong relative to the, yeah.
And there's a new inflorescent, I don't know if you probably can't see it coming up in the very middle. So these bulbs hold, they're not really bulbs, they're pseudobulbs, they're fake bulbs. They hold water and nutrient.
Sure.
Help the plant survive.
So there really is only one plant there. That's not an orchid that's ready to be divided or something.
Well, some people would, but I like to have specimen plants. So I like them big with getting multiple growths on them. So some plants will never have multiple growths. They're just not want to do it. Just like some kids won't be doctors. They'll be teachers. They'll be computer geniuses. It's not their thing. And you don't want to overwater them because that just rots them out. Okay, I'm going to move on. Pleated leaves. I have one that is pleated in my greenhouse because it's a hanging basket, and in the summer it was too close to the shade cloth. It wasn't in the center of the small area I have, so I wasn't able to water all around. And that's from inconsistent watering. It only got watered on one part of it. Those leaves are perfect, but the back part, the leaves got a little pleated. And you don't have to iron those pleats; they will not straighten out. Area on leaves equals sunburn. And I'll never forget, when I first started growing, I emailed someone and said, well, how do you know there's sunburn? Somebody came back with this answer, well, what does sunburn look like on you? Well, sunburn, I don't get sunburn, but I've seen people get sunburn and they have red spots. But sunburn on orchids are black spots.
Okay.
Black, brown spots, but it could also be something else. So just be careful. Black tips on orchid leaves are over fertilization. And you need to take that orchid to the sink and flush, or repot it because the bark will hold accumulations of fertilizer. And with our hard water here, I often see hard white debris left on my pots that it's very hard to get rid of. I use my fingernails when I wash them and sterilize them. That's debris, and that's why you need to flush your orchids.
So again, it goes back again to the quality of the water and why you suggest that just even natural rainwater can be quite helpful.
Yes, if you can capture your rainwater. And that's why you don't put ice on orchids. Ice cubes on orchids. First of all, where orchids live, that we grow in our homes, ice cubes don't fall from the sky and water them. They get rain, they get water, and they also the ice cubes on orchids don't flush them, and they need to be flushed to get rid of excess fertilizer. Okay, that's very important. I can't stress it enough. I actually have a handout about that. And it will also not trigger blooming. That's a bunch of malarkey. So do not use, everyone out there, please do not use ice cubes on your orchids. I know Marianne Benetti said to use them, but when I talked to her about it, she says, well, that just kept the blooms going. I said, well, that was her mother-in-law's idea. So Marianne, we've discussed this at length. She's awesome and willing to learn new things. So now I'm going to talk about pests because they are there. Aphids. We all know what aphids are. You can wash them off with water, or you can. An orchid grower gave me this formula for spraying to kill them. You put water in a spray bottle, and not one that's just like a shot of water, but one that diffuses the spray. You fill it up 98% with water, a couple drops of dish detergent, and then alcohol. And what the dish detergent does is keeps it, and you can use like Dr. Bronner's or whatever if you don't want to use a chemical soap. And the Dr. Bronner's or whatever you pronounce his name, or dish detergent is a fixative, so it'll stick to the aphid, and then the alcohol will dehydrate it and kill it. And you spray them, but you do this in the morning. You don't want to do your watering at night, and you don't want to do your spraying of anything at night, because or even using alcohol and Q-tips to kill things, because you want the orchid to be dry when temperatures are cooler. You don't want to leave anything open for other kinds of diseases. Then you have mealy bugs. And these are disgusting little things, and they look like little cotton. So again, my concoction that I told you about will take the white powdery covering on the mealy bug and kill it. Or you can take a Q-tip and very carefully wipe the leaves and make sure there are no eggs in there. And you'll have to check that plant and maybe isolate it away from your other orchids until they go.
I would think that would be the big risk of the spread of those
Yes,
mealy bugs
it can kill it.
across your
Well,
entire.
when I show you the scale, you'll understand. And here are thripes, and we've gotten them on roses, so most of you know what they are. You have spider mites. You can see the stippling on the leaf here, the white stippling. And on the underside of the leaf, you can see them. You need like a little loop to see what they look like because they can be small. So if you see like little dark spots on the underside of your leaves, and then the stippling, you know, you have spider mites. And this is the worst. This is by Bosubial scale, and it looks like almost like cotton candy around the roots. And as you see, it's growing around the pseudobulb underneath dead material. So you want to keep your plant clean. Hygiene is so important. You don't want to use, if you're cutting back orchids, you don't want to use the same razor blade on two different orchids because you can carry disease. You want to remove any dead debris. As I move my orchids out, I'm cleaning them. When I move them in, I clean them again. I do spot checks constantly. Once a week, I'm always in there checking. I water more frequently than that for my growing conditions. But I'm always checking the orchids. And these are the soft scale, and that's what they look like. And you can even flick them off with your fingernail. Scrape them gently, but they're disgusting. And they will kill a plant, and they will spread in a collection in a heartbeat. And there's also a harder scale that grows. And I used to refer to them as the Battle of World War II when they would appear. That was Rommel's Panzer divisions have invaded the greenhouse, and I have to go out and get rid of them. So that was my silly joke. But they are like armor. They're hard scale, and you want to get rid of them. There's like a darker one over there. The females can reproduce eggs like you can't believe.
Now, are orchids more susceptible to these pests than, say, other houseplants? Because on the one hand, all of these seem to be common pests that we would have in all of our houseplants. But are you
Yes,
saying
and they are. But I'm just going over what they have for orchids, because this is a talk on orchids, and I was asked to include insects and diseases when I give this talk to Master Gardeners. So they are common. Orchids are not that different from any other plant. Some people consider orchids house plants. I consider them orchids. So
there you go.
in nature, they grow outside. So it just, to me, they're so special. It's my crazy corner. So diseases, and they do get diseases. You can get black rot, and you've got to cut that disease part off, and maybe the orchid will live, and it may not. And this happens to be a Cattleya, one of the.
Would you cut in this case, would you cut that entire leaf off, or would you just cut the infected portion off and leave some of the green chlorophyll
I cut
producing?
the whole leaf off. In fact,
Okay.
quite frankly, if I had black rot and it was this big, I would throw the plant out.
Okay.
And these plants can cost like $40, $50, and I just don't want it to spread. And it's often from overwatering. Sometimes if it's a small piece, like in the bottom leaf, you can cut it off the shape of the leaf and then treat the edges where you cut with fresh ground cinnamon. This is when you're watering, if you get your leaves wet, the flower leaves, the petals, the sepals and all, you get botrytis. It's a form of a virus. And here's a very virus. This is a genetically virused Cattleya. You see the breaks in the color in the sepals and in the bottom lip. Throw that plant out, because if water gets on your other plants, it will spread.
And again, the symptoms, I can tell that because of the ragged edges.
Flower.
Yeah.
Breaks in color. And sometimes even the leaves have circular spots in them, and look different. So what pollinates an orchid? Insects, birds, people, and wind. And people do that to make more. So where do you get more information about orchids? Books, a local orchid society, a judging center. AOS.org is my favorite. Some of the online resources are not that good. There are webinars, there are YouTube videos on orchids. There's a supplier called repotme.com that has that I go to often and check out what they have on growing tips and links to different YouTubes, because you never know when you can learn something new. I've been growing orchids since 1997, but that doesn't mean I know everything about orchids. I'm just scratching the surface. And if you go to an orchid show, it's pretty amazing. You can talk to vendors, see many different species. You can see unusual displays. And a lot of people, like at the Northwest Flower and Garden Show, I help a vendor up there. And because it's my orchid fix for the year. So people will write down, they'll see an orchid that's growing and they'll write down the name and the cross. But a lot of times those orchids were bought many years ago. And like other kinds of hybridized plants that we put in our gardens here, an older hybridized form is not readily available anymore. They keep changing them and hybridizing more and more. So you can't always get that kind. Again, you can do a search, and if you join an orchid society, somebody in the orchid society may give you a piece of their plant if you're lucky.
So is that you mentioned AOS? Okay, so AOS, the American Orchid Society.
It is, and you don't have to be a member to use their website.
Is there a Western Washington or Seattle, King County based? Is there a regional orchid society?
They do have orchid societies. There is one in King County. Tacoma has one. I think they're still functioning. I don't know. I joined it and I didn't stay with it. I was president, but I left it because there were very few people in it and I wasn't getting what I wanted out of it. So wasn't meeting my needs. I had been spoiled rotten by being a member of 3 different orchid societies within a half an hour driving distance of where I live back east. But the Seattle one meets Monday nights. I think it's the second Monday of every month. I don't drive up to Seattle. The traffic is just too crazy.
Oh, sure, for sure.
So, and they're not doing webinars yet, but I'm still members of other societies back east, so I get their newsletters and I converse with people back there. But there is an orchid judging program in Portland, and you could research when that meets. The Orchid Judging Center of Seattle didn't get the support, didn't have enough judges or people displaying, so they merged with Portland, and that's where they have the judging centers, and you can learn a lot from going there. Or the Northwest Flower and Garden Show, the Northwest Orchid Society has a display there every year, and their people are stationed there and will talk to you about orchids.
Very good.
So those are places you can go. And there are also unusual displays you can see at shows. Like this gentleman, this was in Florida. One year, a friend of mine gave me this picture. He gave her permission to take it. It was all done. And you never know what you can see at an orchid show. Now, I myself. But interesting. So here's my bibliography, AOS.org, and a book all about their orchids, their orchid sources, all about orchids. So they have sources of books that you can get. You can buy books on orchids. I always buy their new books on how to grow orchids because then I update my PowerPoint and check my knowledge to see what I'm doing is correct or not. So as promised, this is my greenhouse.
Holy cow.
And over on the left-hand side, you'll see a a switch in a box, and that's my exhaust fan. It's nothing more than a bathroom exhaust fan that's vented out to the outside. I brought the tables and legs with me. I bought them from a greenhouse that was going out of business, and the legs are just PVC pipes that were cut. The round wire that I have plants mounted on, my husband made for me. He took wire. Can you see this?
Yes.
And he cut it, and we tied the ends together and then bent in the sharp corners. And I can mount orchids, my species orchids, on here.
Now those are those what the gaps in the mesh there? Is that a couple
That's
inches?
where I can put a hook in.
Okay.
So there are hooks on the mounts. My husband drills a hole and puts the wire in for me.
Very good.
You can mount these, and I want to talk about that. You can put sphagnum moss. You can use Oregon moss, tree moss that you just wash from your garden and put on here to make sure there aren't any bugs in there, and let it air dry a little bit. You can do it in the summer or now, get it ready for the winter. And then you tie them. You tie the plant on with, if you have arthritic fingers like mine are becoming, these stockings you try shoes on with.
Okay.
You can take them and wrap them around and tie it. The water gets through. It keeps it on. If you're still able to use fishing line, that's what most people do because it's not as obvious as the stockings. Or you can get this at a floral supply place. They have this green wire material that you can put around your orchids. So these are ways you can mount them without causing a lot of trouble.
And your point then, you're replicating exactly how these orchids would likely appear in nature. You know,
in nature, exactly. On all the way over to the left side of the screen, you see those clothing racks, shelving racks. Here's one right here.
Yeah.
I have them mounted. I have orchids mounted on those. So if you have a kitchen window that gets good light, for example, you could get mounted orchids or even orchids in pots and put the shelf high on your window. Orchids can come down on them like this. Can you see okay?
That's very clever indeed.
And put the pots on top here so they get sun. And if they drip into your sink and they don't make a big mess on your woodwork. If you have, oops. Oh, can you still see me?
I can still see you.
Well, I lost everything. Oh, here we go again. Let me come back here. Okay, let me go back one. Okay. Or if you have a tiled window, it's all tiled around, you can even hang them here. Take this into your sink, spray the mounted orchids, and put it back, and it can drip dry right into the tile.
That's very clever indeed.
Thank you. Those are all my ideas, folks, but you can share them with anyone you choose.
So you don't have a patent on them. You're not going to sue us if we borrow your ideas here.
No, I will not. And instead of getting more orchids, I don't know, can you see my cursor on your screen?
Yes.
Well, if you see here, these are all species orchids that are mounted.
Okay.
Here, and these are species. And back here, I have the Japanese orchids. And then on the side over here, I have hanging baskets. Along the wall, I have a metal pole. And right in front of you is a tropical carnivorous pitcher plant that I have growing in my greenhouse. They're good companions. So if I have any flying bugs, they'll go there and get eaten, and I don't have to worry about the orchids.
Now, there's a key point. This entire greenhouse is encapsulated inside your garage, right? So it's all artificial light is what these
all artificial light. And they're they're wood, as you can see, structures. I have double bubble that's wrapped around them, and then more plastic. It's seated to the garage. The automatic garage doors can go over them, can go over it without damaging anything. I have a big fan in the top, as you're looking at it, the top left-hand corner, and then one underneath. So the airflow is coming this way. It's from the far corner, it comes down, and then there's another big fan at the bottom that pushes it up. So it's moving the air, and I have a small fan in the far right-hand corner that you can't see from Charlie's greenhouse. It's a clip-on fan, and it does its job.
And so all these lights are on a timer so that they go off,
Yes, and I
yeah.
had to have electricians come, and I had to get a permit to build this within and make sure that it was on. L&I was okay with everything, and it was. I had it's on its own circuit breaker, and
Fascinating.
this orchid oops, I went the wrong way. And this is one that was awarded in HCC. It's Path Moonstone Gracie Girl, and it's named for my granddaughter.
Well, congratulations. That's a beautiful picture.
Thank you. So do you have any more questions?
Well, Gail, this is outstanding. I mean, it's that if folks do have questions for you, may they reach out to you via email?
Certainly.
And so I'll make sure that your email is posted, right, in the postings that come up with this.
Yes.
So how did you, I guess the final question is that, it's fascinating the knowledge you've built over the 20 some odd years you've been doing this. How did you get into this?
I went to Disneyland in the early 70s and took a ride on the Konatiki room, and everyone was singing It's a Small World, all the plants, and the orchids were just singing and flipping, and I just got fascinated by them. So it took me over 20 years to start growing them. I said to my husband, I want to start growing orchids. He said, oh, that's okay. We were newly married. I said, you don't understand. I really want to get into growing orchids. And he didn't understand what it was going to be. But I used to grow them on windowsills, and I had milk crates that I kept 4 2-liter soda bottles in filled. And I had a Devon Rex cat at the time who liked to pull up the bottles and spill the water out. So that's when we had to build a greenhouse, and we had to excavate property. It was 16 by 18. And I had over 1,000 orchids in there.
That's huge. That's tremendous. So eventually he has learned, though, that you really are into orchids, right?
Yes. And gardening as a whole.
And so again, just to recap then is that you've been a master gardener with Pierce County Master Gardeners for how long?
I started there in 2016. I was a master gardener in Pennsylvania starting in 2006. So I was president of the group there, and left and moved here to be closer to my Gracie girl. And the first thing I did was apply to become a master gardener again. And of course, I had to take the program all over because it's such different conditions. And the program here with WSU was just superior to what my first experience. But I'm sure they've grown and changed too in Delaware.
Oh, sure.
I mean, to demean that group, it's just Pierce County is where we started, so it's pretty awesome.
Gail, I want to thank you so very much for your time today. There's a tremendous amount of education and content in here that I'll argue, even if you're not that interested in orchids, there's the uniqueness about how you talked about the nurturing and the care of these plants is so inspiring relative to other horticulture and other thoughts. So from a diagnostic standpoint, from a care and consideration standpoint, there's a lot of related learning that I think we can absorb out of what you've shared here.
It as I went through the program again for the second time, it really stood out to me how similar, while they're different, there's the basic similarity in all of horticulture.
Gail, thank you so very much. Happy Mother's Day and happy Grandmother's Day to you.
And happy Mother's Day to all the marvelous master gardeners in Pacific and County and Grays Harbor. I've met some of you through the Washington Native Plant Society. We just finished Native Plant Appreciation Month, which I'm state chair and local chair in South Sound chapter. So if you come to the South Sound chapter meetings in Olympia, please say hello to me, introduce yourself, and ask orchid questions there.
Very good.